Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The Great Depression, Part 2. Let's get into it. The first thing I think that it's important for us to understand with the Great Depression really is the importance of the 1932 election and the election of President Roosevelt. So, this New Deal coalition, right, that brings Roosevelt into power, um, reflects kind of the desire on the part of many Americans, and I'm paraphrasing some historians here, to kind of shore up the system and not kind of tear everything down. We have to, if we look globally, understand that this was a contentious and difficult time. You have many in America who are unemployed or underemployed. Um, you have rising fascism in Italy and in Germany, which will bring Adolf Hitler into power the next year. The Soviet Union had recently come into existence within the previous 10 years, and Joseph Stalin was in power there. If there was a time where America could have had some real difficulties, right, this could have potentially been a very difficult time. And, FDR had been the governor of New York. He was supportive of progressive causes. This is an individual who, is supportive of activism, right, in terms of government. And that kind of brings us into, his administration. Now, the New Deal, right? So the way this is often characterized is that there's just this New Deal. We need to understand that there's kind of two of them, right? So there's the first New Deal, and then there's the second New Deal. So the first New Deal begins in 1933. It begins in the first 100 days after FDR is inaugurated as President of the United States. The second New Deal, okay, begins in 1935, right? So it's going to build on many of the programs that had either been enacted or had been opposed or had been found to be unconstitutional from the first in 1933. So in 1933, you're going to have a number of programs that are enacted. So the Democratic Congress, right, is going to enact any number of these forms of legislation, and FDR is going to sign this stuff into law. So you're going to have emergency banking relief. You're going to have what's called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and again, a host of other programs. A big part of this was something called the National Recovery Administration, which will lead to what's called the NRA. You're going to have these code authorities. They're going to govern most industries and businesses all over the country. The goal is again, to kind of cement things, kind of standardize the process of recovery with businesses. Some of this stuff, including the NRA, is going to be found, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act are going to be found to be unconstitutional. But there are New Deal programs that will run the arc of much of the 1930s, and will, in looking back, be seen as fairly popular measures in some ways for that time. Not without controversy, of course. So certainly you're going to have the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You're going to have the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. And certainly Social Security is going to arise out of the era of the New Deals. Although when it was enacted, there were limitations in terms of who could and who could not receive Social Security. This is the era in which the concepts like the federal minimum wage are going to come in as well. But again, this stuff was not without controversy within its day. There was opposition to FDR's policies in some cases. It's important for us to note that there were detractors. In 1935 into 1936, the former governor of Louisiana, Huey P. Long, who was a senator by that point, would be an example of those who felt that the New Deal did not go far enough. Now, he was assassinated during that particular time, but the Democrats were quite concerned that he might challenge the president in the election of 1936. So you do have detractors, within this particular era. Father Coughlin, would be another example of this. Another sort of element for us to kind of grapple with here is going to be the Dust Bowls. So end of the 1800s, early 1900s, in western parts of the U.S., you'd had in terms of the environmental structure of much of the land, you'd had this fairly strong grassy, kind of land that had been present. And late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of that stuff gets ripped up, ripped off the land, and it gets used for grazing cattle, or particularly for farming, for wheat and grain and this kind of stuff. And the effect that that has on the environment in that region of the country over the course of a couple of decades means that by the time you get to the 1930s, you're going to end up with what becomes known as the Dust Bowls, where this land, which many thousands of people had migrated and emigrated to, where they had gotten homesteads and thought they would be able to establish themselves and have farms, etc., turns into this real environmental and economic catastrophe zone, where families will have to flee, where young people and others will have to endure these horrific storms, these dust storms, this Dust Bowl, where basically the dust across the plains would get sort of whipped up and picked up and then dropped, all over the West, in some cases making its way as far as Chicago. It was a disaster. And the recovery efforts were not immediate, and communities and people suffered. It was really quite awful. All right. Thank you very much.